Thank you so much for joining our panel today. We're going to be talking about protecting identities in the age of artificial intelligence. I'm joined today by two experts that I've had the pleasure of working with over the past year, Jeremy Grant from the Better Identity Coalition and Juliana Cafik, who was at Microsoft but has been a leader in this space for technology companies. And I'm going to ask each of them to give a little bit more about their background and how they decided to work on this collaboration. Before I do, I want to give you a little bit of context in terms of why we started working on this project quite a while ago. It actually began back in 2024 when the US Treasury Department published a paper on the impact of artificial intelligence on cybersecurity and fraud. That paper, which was part of the previous administration's focus on a AI executive order and action plan, was to really drill down and look more closely at how AI was impacting financial services. That then launched a collaboration involving all associations, many of the firms within the financial services sector, and then we started partnering with other organizations such as the Better Identity Coalition to focus on different aspects of AI and how it would impact on financial services, with a big focus on fraud and cybersecurity. There were a total of 6 different work streams that were launched. Ours, which we're going to talk about today, is focusing on identity and authentication, but there were others that focused on a financial services AI risk management framework, a explainability work stream, a nutrition label work stream, a AI-enabled fraud work stream, and then a lexicon or dictionary of terms that are important to have ground truth in terms of what we're talking about with respect to AI. This whole effort was overseen by a rather unique organization comprised of several CEOs of financial services firms, with public sector leaders from Treasury, the Federal Reserve, the Texas Banking Commission, which also served a role with the Conference of State Bank Supervisors. So it was a somewhat unique collaboration to really drill down and look at the impact of AI and how it was impacting many aspects of financial services. And our group had the pleasure of focusing on identity and authentication. So that's just to give you a little bit of the setting the stage, what we're going to talk about. And we're going to really preview some of the key findings from 2 papers that our work stream has completed. Hopefully they will be released by the time this is broadcast, and we'll be able to share the links to those papers. I'll set that aside for now and want to defer to Jeremy first and then Juliana to give a little bit about their backgrounds.
I'm Jeremy Grant. I serve as the coordinator of the Better Identity Coalition. It's a group I run part-time. My day job is managing director in Venable's cybersecurity practice here in DC. I have been working at the intersection of identity and cybersecurity almost 30 years now, really before either of those was actually considered a discipline in and of its own. Mix of government and industry roles, helping build tech and security solutions, and run companies on the delivery side, but also a couple stints in government, including one leading what was a White House initiative, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, where I was dual-hatted in that role as the lead for identity issues at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So much of my work today is still at the intersection of where government and industry meet with a lot of these issues, and as I think will become apparent as we talk through these papers today, made it for a good partnership with the others here in terms of bringing me and our coalition's resources to the table on this initiative.
Juliana. I am an independent standards and solutions architect in the identity and access management space. I have, like Jeremy, a long background, 30 years, but I have always focused at the intersection of identity and security, essentially. And how do we arrive, independent of the time we were in, how do we arrive at that delicate balance between the two to be able to enable key sectoral alignment between security and identity and efficiency and usability with respect to access for their specific customers. My current focus and really excitement in the project that we've worked on and the papers we've worked on is I think there's been no greater time where that intersection of security and identity is paramount right now with respect to the risks associated with AI, generative AI, and agentic-based AI specifically, but equally the tools that they can provide to help us advance that initiative. How do we actually start to strengthen our security and access management moving forward in fundamental ways? So I see it as a real pivot point, a turning point, and that's why I'm so excited to be able to contribute to this set of papers.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you. And I forgot to mention my role. So my day job is I'm at the American Bankers Association and I focus on cybersecurity and resiliency issues. I also have been very active in our sector coordinating council. We'll sometimes use that acronym name, the FISC, or the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council, and both in the chairing the R&D committee and then now chairing the policy committee. So that's how we all kind of got together, was this unique public-private sector collaboration that the FISC provides. And we have a public sector partner that's chaired by the U.S. Treasury Department, again, has another horrible acronym called the FBIC, the Federal Banking Information Infrastructure Committee. And that's the framework that we've been operating really ever since the 9/11 attacks, to focus on aspects of cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection. So my first question is going to go to Jeremy. First, tell us, why would the Better Identity Coalition that you kind of oversee be involved in this effort? And then tell us a little bit about what the paper revealed.
Sure. So starting with the coalition, I think when we had the invite to co-chair this with ABA, it was a no-brainer. Better Identity Coalition, for those who don't know the group, was launched in 2018 in the wake of the big Equifax breach, where there were a lot of policymaker questions and industry questions around what government policy should be when it came to protecting digital identity. And since then, we've grown to about 24 members, heavy participation from the financial services industry and others that I would call big buyers of digital identity and authentication solutions that they need to run and secure their business. But our goal is, how do we partner with industry and government to improve digital security, privacy, and convenience for everyone, with a focus on driving the development and adoption of better solutions that can protect identities online. So the FISC, look, many of our bank members in the coalition are active members there. And then, as you mentioned, the FISC bringing in their government counterparts in the policy and regulatory side in the FBIC to collaborate. This was the sort of initiative that we felt like we were built for. So, what are the threats? Well, I think the main thing to understand is that we're at an inflection point right now, in that attacks that were really hard and required a lot of technical expertise, a lot of resources to pull off when it came to compromising different aspects of the way we protect identity authentication, they're now becoming cheap and easy. The attacks in many cases are being commoditized, in large part because of attack tools that are exploiting the capabilities of generative AI, like deepfakes. And with this, we're also seeing the attacks that used to be very hard to implement. Not only are they easy, they're also easy to implement at scale. And that is starting, I think, to really change the equation in terms of what are the threats that financial services firms, and frankly others, in different critical industries, need to be thinking of when it comes to the attacks they might be seeing. I think we're at a point today in early 2026 where, at a high level, any video, any voice, any photo of a face or an ID card, deepfakes can now pretty convincingly spoof it. And so, given that a lot of the tools that we use to safeguard the financial services sector, say at account opening, where I might ask you to take a picture of your ID card and take a selfie with your phone, or using voice recognition at a call center, a lot of the tools that we've used to, essentially guard ourselves against online attacks, well, it's a bit of a new ballgame these days. Does it make sense, John, to talk now about the paper and some of the specific attacks we saw, or do you want to, riff on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that'd be really helpful because, for folks, and this is one of the things I thought was great about the paper, and there's actually two papers that we're going to be talking about. The first paper lays out the different types of attacks that we're starting to see already, as well as anticipating some down the road. It also includes a maturity model that we'll talk a little bit about. And then the second paper really focuses on some policy recommendations. So yeah, I think it'd be great, Jeremy, to talk about what we found in terms of the attack types. And then we'll go to Juliana to talk about what are some of the controls. How can we have some measure of hope in terms of how to deal with this?
At a high level, we tried to break, the attacks that we were seeing into 10 tactics, but I would say at a higher level, 3 different attack vectors. So the first one is what I would call deepfake-driven social engineering and impersonation. And, there's 6 different attacks. One was the one I just described before. With a bank, I'm relying on my customer's smartphone to have them take a picture of their ID and their selfie. Well, if either or both of those can be faked with generative AI, you now have a whole other set of attacks to worry about. In the old days, I might, say if I was trying to look like somebody else in an ID, I would make a rubber mask like in the Mission Impossible movies. These days, I don't have to go that far. I can try to inject in a photo of me as that person, but maybe my face is morphed in with theirs so that it can pass a biometric check. We also talked about deepfake voices against call centers or help desks, where we're seeing, they say these days, I guess I'm putting myself at risk. If I get about 10 seconds of your voice talking online, I can feed that into an engine and spoof your voice and get you to say almost anything convincingly. So I'm sure somebody's going to go have at that right now because of this webinar. I think the third is we're seeing less attacks on identity verification, more authentication, phishing attacks. A lot of times you can cut through these attacks pretty quickly. Well, now you can ask an AI to basically, create something that sounds exactly like it's coming from a bank in their tone and bring their logo in and things like that. And so if I'm trying to compromise passwords or even some of the legacy types of one time of MFA, like one-time passcodes or codes being texted, I think fourth, we're seeing specific targeted attacks against companies or individuals using some of these deepfake tools. The most famous one was a couple years ago in Hong Kong. There was a guy who worked in the finance department for a company, was asked to jump on a Zoom call, had three of his colleagues all there on video saying something was really urgent and he needed to wire $25 million to an offshore account. All of those videos were faked using Gen AI. The fifth is deepfakes against authentication. Again, here we're pointing out in some cases, if you're using, say, a central match biometric, to take a picture of your face and log somebody in, which we don't see as much as we see with local on-device biometrics then being used to unlock a cryptographic key, say the passkey model. But in some cases where you're using a biometric for authentication that's centrally matched, you will now see injection attacks that are injecting a deepfake into the stream. And then the sixth we talked about was really cross-channel attacks, where it might start, say, with a spoofed photo that I'm transmitting through my smartphone, but then will suddenly come in, say, with a call to the call center that's also being spoofed. And so now, say, if you're a bank, you're getting hit with a deepfake from two different channels, and it may be hard to identify just what's happening. So those were the six that were in the first attack vector around social engineering and impersonation. The next three really dealt with synthetic identity creation. Synthetic IDs are when you come up with an ID that looks like it's real, but doesn't actually correspond to a real person. My wife was just a victim of this last month, or I don't know if she was actually a victim in that they were using her ID, but they weren't. They took her name and her address, but put in a date of birth and SSN that weren't hers. And we suddenly got a very premium, I won't say what bank was involved, but credit card delivered to our house. We're also seeing a lot of this in remote hiring. There's been a lot of articles and some DOJ indictments around the North Koreans getting particularly good with placing remote IT workers in different organizations where, they are essentially, using deepfake technology to make somebody look, how will I say it, not like they're in North Korea when they're coming for a video job interview. And then the next thing you know have a North Korean agent in your IT systems as an admin, and the salary you're paying that agent is going to fuel North Korea's weapons program. Lots of winning all around there. And then I think the third with synthetic ID is more what we call real-time deepfake fraud, which is more just when this is happening on the fly, trying to create a synthetic ID. The last attack vector is really one that's just starting to emerge, which is starting to look at AI agents and how they might be used to automate fraud campaigns or also play a role in account takeover. We could probably do a whole separate webinar just on agentic identity issues and the challenges there, but we mostly flag that as an emerging area that's going to need more attention in the years to come.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeremy. And I'm going to turn now to Juliana. I'm hoping you're going to give us a little bit of hope in terms of what are the different tools that are out there that institutions can use in order to protect institutions and individuals, I should say, to protect themselves.
I think that I'll begin to answer that question with a little bit of a framing of my perspective on this so that there's the appropriate context to my response. The first is that identity constructs or frameworks for identity interaction are really important here. And to understand our existing construct for identity and how CSPs and other identity service providers really function within the construct. So essentially, we have a functional layer that's the interface between identity and systems. And we have a foundational principle of separation, where the identity interaction with systems is very distinct from the core identity itself. And that's really important in understanding how we start to evolve as an industry as a whole in prevention of many of these really innovative risks that we're starting to face. The next is that the construct is quite contextual, meaning it's use case specific. Jeremy, noted a credit card. That's a specific context. Opening a bank account, accessing healthcare, travel, and so on have their own contexts within the identity construct. And the interesting thing with emergent AI is that AI agents are starting, and autonomous AI, as well as generative AI, are starting to enable state awareness for themselves and dynamic agentic behavior. So basically, they are starting to exploit vulnerabilities in our existing construct, which begin at the separation principle between the identity itself and the access to the systems. So when we look at CSPs, now to answer your question, John, the CSPs are critical here as provisioners of tools to start to detect and defeat many of the attacks that Jeremy was describing. So they have really started to rapidly evolve their security infrastructures to detect and defeat AI-based attacks. And they're adopting strategies of using AI to fight AI. So the tools that are being used to exploit are now being used to advance the protection mechanisms and advance really in significant ways the tools that are being used to combat it. So one is machine learning to detect anomalies and automated attacks, such as things like detect rapid automation login attempts, the implementation of more sophisticated AI-based web application firewalls to identify abnormal request patterns from AI-powered web scraping and automated DDoS attacks, autonomous threat analysis, so specifically using agentic AI and adversarial multi-agent reinforcement. So what that means is put a red team that is acting as an attacker and a blue team that is acting as an agent literally validating defenses to discover those vulnerabilities and generate new threat detection rules very, very quickly. And multimodal deepfake detection using neural networks and hunting for digital signatures that are left by Gen AI tools that indicate deepfake threats. We have two fundamental areas. One is called Continuous Access Evaluation Profile, or CAPE, and it moves from a point-in-time authentication to a continuous dynamic risk assessment. And that, I think, is going to be a big game changer moving forward for the CSPs. We also see risk incident sharing and coordination, and that handles the overarching lifecycle of an account to prevent cross-platform account takeovers, because we live, let's face it, in an interconnected ecosystem, and account takeovers across platforms is a big risk that needs to be addressed. So essentially, shared signals now start to begin to replace slow manual log correlations with automated event-driven architectures that provide scalability and arrive at what I refer to as a more dynamic awareness of state. So rather than risk detection, it's really more proactive risk prevention in a dynamic and state-aware fashion. So I think the important things here for the CSPs is they are beginning now to reevaluate the foundations of security and implementing sets of controls that start to manage risks and preserve the integrity of interactions in this new world. So that is really critical. We are also seeing some really important innovations in both cryptographic verification, new tools such as zero-knowledge proofs for allowing the verification of a claim without exposing the underlying raw data. So essentially, there's no honeypot in there for AI to try and draw from. We're seeing machine-to-machine cryptographic workload identities that stop autonomous agents from scraping credentials and executing rapid lateral account takeovers. And we're starting to see one of my favorites, and something I'm heavily engaged with, is cryptographic binding, essentially acting as runtime security layers, and that when combining cryptographic identity constructs, such as a mobile driver's license, we can start to establish guardrails that ensure an AI agent can only execute an action if it's bound cryptographically to the specific intent or purpose of that interaction. So essentially, we're starting to see emerging tools, real energy and investment from the CSPs into starting to essentially create a new identity construct that moves towards identity proofing first, then strong authentication, and that it's starting to enable that prevention. And then when we start to layer on things like shared signals and CAPE and so on, and all the innovative tools, we start to have a really strong foundation now for not only identity, but security in this new agentic world.
And I want to just show so people can see. So this is what the paper actually looks like. It's only about 23 pages long. One of Jeremy's colleagues, Zach Martin, did a really nice job in drafting very short, short examples of what this looks like with humans in the middle. And then it also talks about, as Julia covered, what are some of the mitigations that organizations can deploy in order to defend against these types of attacks. The other thing, which also reflects the process that we went through, we had about 60 experts from financial services firms, all different sizes. We also had all of the financial associations involved in this and a few technology companies. And importantly, we had several representatives from 4 government agencies: FinCEN, National Institutes of Standards and Technology, DHS's CISA, and also U.S. Treasury. And they provided some really helpful ideas and concepts and resources that we could link to. And I want to pass this question over to Jeremy to talk about why the work that FinCEN has done was so helpful in terms of framing the paper, in terms of the different attack types, and also the mitigations.
So FinCEN has been doing some fantastic work. I think a lot of it's really flown under the radar the last couple of years to start to actually quantify both the impact of identity-related threats to the financial services sector overall, but also specifically looking at some of the threats from deepfakes as they're starting to see them come in through the suspicious activity reports that banks file. So first, just over 2 years ago in January 2024, FinCEN released a study, actually at our coalition's annual policy forum, that did a really interesting thing that I guess seemed kind of obvious, but nobody had ever done before, which was, they went through all of the suspicious activity reports that they had received in 2021 from different banks and started to look through how many of them were actually tied to some sort of a compromise of identity. And what they found was the numbers were pretty overwhelming. 42% of all of the SARs that they had received, totaling, I think it was $212 billion in change in transactions, were all tied to a compromise of identity. In some cases, it was a credential compromise. In some cases, it was a compromise ID verification. They sort of mapped out some of those issues. But for the first time, it put a number on what the scope of the problem is. And while FinCEN hasn't yet formally released their updated reports, they've spoken about what they're seeing at a couple industry conferences. I think if you look at 2023, those numbers are now close to 400 billion in losses and close to 70% of all of the SARs they're getting, which suggests the problem's getting worse. They also last November, I'm sorry, I guess say 2 Novembers ago now, November 2024, put out an advisory specifically looking at what they were seeing with deepfake fraud and flagged essentially 9 red flags for banks to keep an eye out for in terms of where you might be seeing a deepfake powered attack and, trying to give people, hey, these are the things to keep your eyes peeled for, given the attacks we're seeing. They also created a new code for the SARS report so that if a bank is filing a suspicious activity report with FinCEN, they could check off if it was actually using one of these specific deepfake specific attack vectors.
One of the things that we did as we were reaching the tail end of the work, we then reached out to the major AI companies. And this was being done for all of the different papers that I mentioned earlier. And during a meeting that we had with 5 of the AI companies that participated, they provided some really helpful feedback in terms of how to frame the different attack types, also to clarify a few areas. And they also were pretty forward leaning in terms of advocating for more robust controls than we initially had in the paper, which we thought was a really useful, helpful input. So I want to maybe put this to Juliana first, and then Jeremy, if he wants to comment after that. How do you think these papers, once they are formally released, will be used by cloud service providers and others that are involved in defending and protecting institutions and individuals?
The cloud service providers have such a broad mandate. Like they provide the foundational infrastructure layer required to achieve our North Star, essentially. And they have a huge role in and responsibility to provide scalability and real-time state awareness. But I think that the key for them is understanding the critical nature of this and the urgency that really this paper is starting to focus on is the urgency in understanding the actual risks that these AI-powered attack vectors form for financial institutions. They are a target, and the urgency and necessity to build resilient cloud architectures that are necessary to defend against them now is really critical. I think the risk to the financial sector creates what I would refer to as a hole in our economic bucket that we can't afford to have continue, and we can't afford to have it get larger. So that there are some fundamental things that the cloud service providers can do, and they are I would say, an essential service in the mission to starting to combat and build resilient architectures moving forward. And they also provide the compute power to solve bottlenecks that to process advanced liveness detection, seek out injection attack detection, apply continuous behavioral biometrics at scale. Those things create a massive strain on the financial institution on-prem infrastructure. So CSPs understanding the urgency and the scale of the financial sector can start to use their frameworks to optimize their cloud environments to help the financial sector would be my call to action for the CSPs, so that we can start to provision the essential services that the financial sector requires to mitigate these risks moving forward.
And Jeremy, I can think of no better person to answer this next question, and that is, why is public sector involvement necessary? And what can the public sector do to help protect consumers and businesses from malicious use of generative AI?
The first is almost everything that financial services firms do with identity authentication are pretty heavily regulated. There's rules that govern how banks verify the identity of new customers, what they have to be doing to authenticate customers signing into accounts online. In many cases, these rules are a little outdated. They haven't necessarily kept pace with both the way that the attackers have been innovating, along with how those of us on the defense side have been coming up with new tools. And so we think more clarity is needed in guidance from Treasury and the regulators in terms of the types of tools that firms should be using and should be encouraged to use, because we definitely see this gap between, again, where the evolution is in terms of attack and defend tools that are out there, and then where the regulators' understanding might be. The second is a bit more of a direct government, a bit more of an area where direct government involvement we think is needed, in that at the end of the day in the US, government is the only authoritative issuer of identity. Now, that role is split between a mix of federal, state, and local officials. I've got a birth certificate from the county in Michigan I was born. I live in DC. They give me a driver's license. The feds give me a passport and a social security number. I can take any of those physical documents and go to a bank across the street or a government agency a couple blocks away or a hospital and use it to prove who I am. But we don't have counterparts to those online. And so, I call it a little secret, but I don't even think it's a secret. What financial services firms use to try and determine who's who online, to figure out, is it really John Carlson or Jeremy Grant or a proverbial dog on the internet, are a bunch of products that have arisen to try to guess what only the government knows. And that's not to, throw shade at them. A lot of them actually work relatively well. But I think we're seeing that we're at this inflection point right now where a lot of those tools that are trying to predict whether somebody is who they say they are now coming under attack by deepfakes and might be less resilient than they were in the past. And so we think there's an important role for government to play as that authoritative source of identity data, as the authoritative issuer of identity, to play a bigger role in this next wave of identity verification solutions that we'll use, be it through things like attribute validation services. The SSA, for example, will validate, is there really a Jeremy Grant with this date of birth and SSN who's not dead, through their ECBSV program. That stands for, it's a mouthful, Electronic Consent-Based Social Security Number Verification System. Just getting that yes or no answer is a massive tool to help reduce synthetic identity fraud. In fact, probably would have prevented that high-value credit card from being delivered to our house a couple months ago, and that synthetic attack I talked about. Also, just by closing the gap between physical and digital credentials, we're really bullish in our coalition about things like mobile driver's licenses. And, one thing we often point out is deepfakes might convincingly spoof a video, a photo, a voice, and ID card. They can't spoof possession of a private cryptographic key, yet at least. Maybe in 10 years when they marry quantum computers, well, maybe we'll all move to the woods and go off the grid. But in the meantime, we think cryptographically verifiable digital credentials like mobile driver's licenses are one of the best tools that we have collectively as a country to try and address some of these threats. And, bluntly, we think more effort needs to be done at both the federal and state level to start getting those into the people's hands. So we talk about, some things there as well in the policy paper.
Well, thank you both. It's been a real pleasure working with you guys on these papers. I also want to thank the dozens of other colleagues that collaborated on this effort, our folks at the various government agencies. We hope you take these papers, use these papers, build upon these papers. I will say they are very accessible, even though they talk about a highly technical topic, and really meant to educate and highlight where there are some solutions out there today, as well as point to policy recommendations that we think will advance the ball. So with that, I'd like to thank Troy Leach at CSA for inviting us to speak today, and we hope you guys have a good rest of your conference. Thank you.